The government never feared drought. It feared independent civilians. Long before the collapse, water purification knowledge wasn't lost. It was restricted, redacted, fragmented across classified survival manuals and emergency response frameworks the public was never meant to see. Clean water is not a humanitarian resource, it's a leverage mechanism. Control the water, and you control behavior. Control purification knowledge, and you control entire populations without deploying a single soldier. That is why the 7 purification tricks disappeared quietly from public education, scrubbed from civilian handbooks, buried beneath layers of safety concerns that sounded noble, but were nothing more than strategic containment. When society fell, the consequences were immediate and brutal. People believed boiling was salvation because that was the narrative they were allowed to keep. They were never taught that boiling leaves petrochemical residue intact, that industrial solvents survive heat, that heavy metals don't evaporate away. The state needed civilians dependent on municipal treatment plants, chemical supply chains, and federal relief infrastructure. Dependency breeds obedience. Sovereignty breeds rebellion. So the techniques that produced clean water anywhere, desert, fallout zones, chemical spill regions, were quietly labeled impractical, unsafe, or too scientific for the public. But the truth is simpler. These tricks were banned because they removed the state from your survival equation. They make you self-sustaining in a world designed to keep you compliant. Learn them, and the collapse stops being a threat. It becomes an equalizer. Phase shift filtration is the first technique the government worked to suppress because it reveals an uncomfortable truth. Water can be separated from its contaminants without a single manufactured filter, chemical packet, or industrial membrane. You were taught that purification requires gear because gear can be regulated, taxed, restricted, or withheld, but temperature cannot be outlawed, and evaporation obeys no government. The moment civilians understand that purity is a function of physics, not infrastructure, the state loses its monopoly on survival. The technique begins with rejecting the civilian mistake of thinking contamination floats in the water. In reality, the water itself wants to leave the contaminants behind. When you create a controlled phase shift from liquid to vapor, you force a molecular divorce between what is water and what is poison. Heat does not have to be intense, it only has to be directional. A low, stable temperature applied to a broad surface encourages evaporation without rolling boil, allowing even polluted, oily, metallic, or biologically compromised water to surrender its clean vapor. The trick lies in capturing that vapor on improvised condensation surfaces, metal scraps, glass panes, ceramic shards, even polished stone. Wherever vapor meets cold mass, purity reforms. The government discouraged this method by framing it as distillation, a word that intimidates civilians. But this is not laboratory work. This is terrain-based molecular engineering. In the field, a survivor bends airflow, positions heat sources, and manipulates shade patterns to create microclimates where vapor forms, travels, and condenses. No pump, no filter, no chemical dependency. Just physics exploited with intent. Once you grasp this, dirty rivers, foul ponds, chemical-tainted runoff, and even brackish coastal pools stop being threats. They become raw material. Phase shift filtration grants you what the old world denied: purification without permission. The soil beneath your feet was never just dirt. It was a filtration engine the government quietly relied on, but never allowed civilians to understand. Public education reduced soil to a planting medium, a passive substance, something inert. But in collapse response manuals, The real ones, the restricted ones. Soil is described as a dynamic matrix capable of performing complex purification stages without chemicals or machines. That information was withheld because it gives civilians the one advantage institutions cannot tolerate: the ability to build long-term, self-sustaining filtration systems anywhere on the planet without oversight, infrastructure, or supply chains. If you can purify water using nothing but terrain, you are no longer manageable. The confident mistake most survivors make is assuming the ground filters water naturally, which is how people die from shallow wells and random pits that do nothing but mask danger. Soil does not filter because it exists. It filters because it is structured. When arranged with intent, layers of fine sand, dense clay, porous gravel, bioactive humus, and carbon-rich sediment create a vertical gauntlet that forces contaminants to collide with physical barriers, chemical binding sites, and microbial kill zones. Water passing through this column is not merely strained. It is interrogated, slowed, trapped, and stripped of particulate and biological threats. This is why the state reserved soil matrix schematics for controlled emergency teams while feeding civilians the lie that filtration requires a factory-made system. In the field, the matrix becomes your silent infrastructure. A properly built column can operate for weeks without maintenance, processing runoff, swamp seepage, or flood water into a stable pre-purified supply. With time, microbial layers adapt to the load, forming living strata that neutralize organic contaminants more efficiently than chemicals ever could. The government suppressed this because such systems decentralize control. They allow communities to survive without shipments, aid convoys, or purification tablets, an unacceptable outcome in a world built on dependency. Once you master the soil matrix, you stop searching for clean water. You build the mechanism that makes it. The advanced solar fusion method became unsafe for civilian instruction, not because it failed, but because it worked too well without fuel, infrastructure, or state oversight. The old world taught you the children's version of solar purification: leave a bottle in the sun and hope ultraviolet radiation does the rest. That version was harmless. It was slow, inconsistent, and dependent on perfect conditions. The real technique, the one woven quietly into emergency response protocols the public never saw, uses controlled light density, thermal amplification, and pathogen kill curve exploitation to produce sterilization levels that rival industrial plants. That knowledge was restricted because it eliminates the single greatest leverage governments hold during crises: energy dependency. If you can sterilize water without fire, grid power, tablets, or chemicals, you escape their supply chain entirely. That cannot be allowed in a managed population. The method does not rely on sunlight alone. It relies on the manipulation of how sunlight behaves. A thin column of water absorbs heat inefficiently, but a widened basin, darkened beneath with soot or carbon dust, captures and magnifies thermal load. Tilt that basin to track the sun's arc, and the temperature rises far beyond civilian expectations. Now seal it beneath a transparent barrier, glass, plastic, salvage sheet polymers, and you trap infrared radiation, creating a micro-greenhouse chamber lethal to pathogens. In polluted environments, dust in the air scatters light, but scattering is not loss. It is redistribution. Use reflective debris to funnel that dispersed light back onto the chamber, and the fusion cycle continues. As heat climbs, particulates settle, microbial colonies collapse, and volatile contaminants degrade under sustained energy saturation. You aren't boiling. You're weaponizing light, and that is why the method was buried. The state cannot regulate the sun, and once you learn to command it, Neither can anyone else. Charcoal was never the secret. Activation was. The government allowed civilians to believe that any burnt wood could purify water because that misconception was safe. It kept the public dependent on commercial filters when their crude attempts failed. But the real threat to institutional control wasn't charcoal. It was the possibility that ordinary people could create high-efficiency toxin-stripping reactors from scrap, fire, and pressure alone. Activated carbon is a molecular magnet. It captures solvents, pesticides, industrial runoff, heavy metals, even the chemical residues left behind after boiling in solar treatment. If civilians mastered its creation, entire regions could operate independent water systems without oversight, taxation, or rationing. That is why the real method was omitted from public survival manuals. Not for safety, but for control. The operational principle is simple but powerful. Carbon becomes activated when its internal structure fractures into a labyrinth of microscopic pores. Those pores increase surface area beyond anything civilians imagine. A handful of activated carbon can possess the internal surface equivalent of a football field. To create this in the field, you do not merely burn wood, you heat it under limited oxygen, then shock it with rapid cooling or controlled steam exposure. The material hisses, cracks, and expands, transforming from inert charcoal into a tactical filtration engine. Pack it into a column, force water through slowly, and contaminants bind to the carbon matrix as if pulled by gravity. The slower the flow, the more complete the extraction. With repeated cycles, even metallic traces fade. Governments restricted this knowledge because it collapses the distinction between industrial purification and personal survival. Once you grasp activation, you can strip poison from water sources officials declare dangerous, unsalvageable, or restricted. You reclaim territory they wrote off. You operate beyond their logistical reach. In a world rebuilt from ruins, activated carbon is more valuable than any weapon because it gives you the only resource every faction kills for: clean water, on demand, without permission. Atmospheric water harvesting was never dismissed because it was ineffective. It was dismissed because it was too effective in the hands of civilians. The greatest illusion the old world engineered was that water exists only where you can see it. Rivers, lakes, wells, pipes. But the air above you, even the air in a desert, carries a hidden reservoir that renews itself every night. Governments buried this method because it bypasses every controlled distribution system. You don't need a pump. You don't need a grid. You don't need a permit. You only need the discipline to understand condensation as a weapon, not a weather phenomenon. They preferred a population terrified of scarcity over one capable of extracting water from the sky itself. The principle is brutally simple. Air cools at night, vapor condenses, and any surface colder than the surrounding atmosphere becomes a magnet for moisture. Survivors, driven by panic, overlook this predictable cycle. They chase rivers, fight over wells, die near dry basins while the humidity above them was enough to sustain life. When you construct a dew trap, you are not collecting drops. You are intercepting the atmospheric hydration cycle. A sheet of metal angled toward night winds, a tarp stretched over a pit that cools faster than ambient air. Even shattered glass rearranged into a radiative surface can draw moisture out until it beads, forms rivulets, and gathers into the waiting basin below. Salt accelerates the process. Clay amplifies nighttime cooling. Vegetation blankets hold pockets of trapped humidity that can be forced to release with temperature inversion. Atmospheric harvesting works because the world cannot stop evaporation and therefore cannot stop condensation. This is why states worked so hard to portray it as fringe or impractical. It renders drought zones negotiable, deserts survivable, and hostile terrain irrelevant. Once you realize water does not need to be found, only captured, you break free from the psychological chokehold collapse imposes. You stop searching for hydration and start extracting it from the air itself, quietly, predictably, endlessly. Directional boiling was the line the government never wanted civilians to cross because once you understand thermal signature separation, you stop being vulnerable to chemical contamination. The one domain they counted on to keep purification specialized. Boiling was marketed as a universal fix because it was harmless knowledge, effective against biological threats, yet completely ineffective against the contaminants that matter most in industrial zones, conflict zones, or collapse-era spill regions. The state needed civilians convinced that heat is binary. Either you boil water or you don't. What they hid was the reality that contaminants possess distinct volatility thresholds, and if you know how to exploit them, you can strip poisons apart with precision they could never allow outside regulated facilities. The operational shift begins with rejecting the myth that all impurities remain behind during boiling. Many solvents evaporate early. Some evaporate late. Some transform under heat into compounds the public was never educated to recognize. The key is directional vapor capture. You are no longer boiling water for safety. You are persuading contaminants to reveal themselves by manipulating temperature stages. Low heat teases out volatile compounds that escape before water even simmers. Capture those vapors and you remove the first layer of danger. Increase the temperature gradually, and biological agents collapse while heavier contaminants remain trapped. Push heat further, and the water finally vaporizes, abandoning metals, particulates, and complex toxins that cannot follow. The boil was never the point. The sequence was. In the field, survivors use makeshift condensers, metal sheeting, intact bottles, salvaged pipes to guide vapor toward a cooling zone where only purified steam reforms into liquid. What emerges is water separated not by gear, but by intelligence. And that intelligence was exactly what governments sought to restrict. When civilians learn thermal signatures, they become immune to engineered contamination campaigns, industrial sabotage zones, or poisoned infrastructure used to shape population movement. They cannot be redirected. They cannot be culled through scarcity. They become unpredictable, and unpredictability is the enemy of control. Directional boiling isn't just a purification method. It's a reclamation of autonomy in a world conditioned to fear the very contaminants it can outthink. The government's greatest fear was never pathogens. It was civilians learning to control them. Biological override was classified not because it was dangerous, but because it shattered the myth that dirty water stays dirty unless treated by the state. In truth, water has always contained two armies: the organisms that threaten you, and the organisms that can be weaponized to protect you. The old world buried this because once civilians understand microbial competition, they stop depending on chemical treatment plants and start cultivating self-regulating water ecosystems beyond state oversight. A population capable of engineering biological balance is a population that no longer needs centralized purification infrastructure, and that threat was unacceptable. The confident mistake most survivors make is assuming all microbes are enemies. They boil everything, sterilize everything, fear everything, And in doing so, they destroy the very microorganisms that could neutralize pathogens for them. Biological override is not about adding chemicals, it's about introducing dominant microbial strains that outcompete, suppress, or consume the contaminants that make water unsafe. Slow-flowing ponds, stagnant basins, and organic runoff zones look hostile because civilians lack the operational lens to see the battlefield. But once you recognize that beneficial microbes can convert ammonia, break down organic toxins, and starve harmful bacteria of oxygen, you stop trying to sterilize water and start trying to control the war inside it. The method is deceptively simple. Establish oxygen zones, introduce stable beneficial colonies, and allow them to metabolize the waste load. Plant roots, porous clay, charcoal beds, even decomposing leaf litter can serve as microbial scaffolds, creating a layered ecosystem that denies pathogens the conditions they need to regenerate. This was rejected from public knowledge because it empowers individuals to reclaim wastewater, stormwater, or flood remnants, sources the state insisted were unusable without industrial intervention. It also gives you time, the most valuable resource in collapse, because once override stabilizes, the water purifies itself while you move on to more pressing threats. Biological override doesn't make you a chemist or a biologist. It makes you sovereign over processes the government monopolized. When you learn to marshal microbes instead of fearing them, you rewrite the rules of purification. You stop reacting to contamination and begin commanding the environment itself. Coagulation was buried under the label of folk science for one reason. It gives civilians the power to reclaim water the state wanted written off as unusable. The official narrative insisted that stagnant ponds, muddy basins, post-flood slurry, and silty riverbeds were beyond civilian capability. Too dirty, too opaque, too biologically dense to be purified without industrial clarifiers. That narrative was strategic. If you believe water is a lost cause, you submit to ration lines and relief stations. But the truth is that natural coagulants outperform many commercial agents when deployed with intent, and that truth undermines every scarcity-based control mechanism the old world relied on. The principle is brutally elegant. Contaminants do not have to be removed individually. They only need to be forced to gather, collapse, and sink. Certain seeds, mineral-rich clays, pulverized tree bark, and specific plant extracts cause suspended particles to bind into heavier masses. Once bound, gravity completes the operation. Survivors who lack this understanding waste hours filtering sludge through cloth, coffee filters, or sand columns, never realizing the water could have been cleared in minutes with the right agent. The government publicly dismissed natural coagulation as unreliable because admitting its effectiveness would expose how easily civilians could reclaim even disaster-blackened water sources. When deployed correctly, coagulation transforms the dirtiest water into a manageable Stage 1 supply. Clarity returns, pathogens lose their protective shielding, and sediment-heavy basins become serviceable again. You aren't purifying yet, you're preparing the battlefield. Coagulation is the opening strike in a multi-stage operation, stripping water of the very turbidity that hides chemical threats and microbial clusters. It gives your other purification systems, thermal, solar, carbon-based, the clean canvas they need to operate at peak efficiency. That is why the method was suppressed. Once civilians master natural agents, the category of unusable water no longer exists, and with it, neither does the leverage of controlled scarcity. Coagulation is not a trick. It is a declaration that contamination may be dense, but it is never invincible. Survival was never about strength, improvisation, or luck. It was about who controlled the water. The collapse exposed a truth the old world spent decades burying. Civilians were never meant to be self-sufficient. Every purification dependence, chemical packets, municipal plants, factory-made filters, grid-tied pumps, was a chain disguised as convenience. When those systems died, most people died with them, not from dehydration, but from the psychological paralysis of believing they were helpless without the state. The seven-band techniques shattered that illusion because they strip away the final layer of dependency and return sovereignty to the individual. Once you master phase shift separation, soil matrix filtration, solar fusion, carbon activation, atmospheric capture, thermal sequencing, biological override, and natural coagulation, the terrain stops dictating your fate. Poisoned rivers become resources. Mud basins become reservoirs. Fog banks become supply lines. Even the most hostile environments lose their power to intimidate you. The world becomes navigable again, not because it has improved, but because you have. You operate with a clarity the government feared, the realization that water is everywhere, and purification is a process of intelligence, not infrastructure. With that knowledge, the collapse no longer feels like an ending. It feels like the first moment you stopped being dependent and started being dangerous. This final shift is not emotional. It is operational. You no longer measure safety by proximity to systems you once trusted. You measure it by your ability to extract life from hostile environments without permission, oversight, or rescue. Clean water is more than hydration. It is autonomy, mobility, bargaining power, and strategic leverage. And when you command it, you are no longer surviving the collapse, you are shaping what comes after.